welcome. Thanks for your introduction, Rafe. And you stole my thunder about, it's ironical talking about green spaces in this darkened chamber on a fine day. But anyway, here we are. Thank you very much. So let's get straight into what I'll cover. I do want to talk a little bit about the health aspects. Why are green spaces good for you? I'm actually not going to go into are they good for you, because I think they are, and there's plenty to show that. I guess the main substance of what I'll summarise is what do we know about New Zealand urban green space. And then I want to go on to a few more interesting issues, but very briefly, considering how much green space we need in Wellington and New Zealand. And what do we want from our green spaces here in this city. Resilience is in my talk. It doesn't feature in those points. And I do want to weave some ideas about resilience into all the sections of the talk and our discussion, and thereby providing an overview of urban green spaces and its role to Wellington and resilient cities in Aotearoa, New Zealand. So those who've heard me rabbit on about this topic before, apologies if you do recognise a little bit of recycled material. You may not recognise it at all, of course, but if you do, I hope there's enough new material for you to find some interest. So, cutting to the chase, how do natural places and green spaces facilitate our health and well-being? And I have got some references for, if you can see at the bottom, and I'm pleased to share those with you. The best recent review of the topic by Terry Hartig and colleagues establishes a number of different mechanisms, but I think there are three most important ones. Firstly, the direct restorative effects for both mental and physical health and well-being. Recovery from stress, improved moods, mental recharging, and then physically reduced blood sugar levels and better immune system functioning. There is evidence for all those pathways. It's occasionally contested, but I'm only reporting the more solidly established pathways. Interestingly enough, our contact with green spaces mediates these effects often through two very important mechanisms on their own, and that is that green space provides opportunities to undertake physical activity, and there is a very strong research base to establish links between levels of physical activity and better health outcomes. And secondly, if we do those things with other people, then equally there's good research that enhances our mental well-being. So all in all, that's a good summary, I feel. And if I had to choose one study or a series of studies to best illustrate all those mechanisms and all those pathways working, I'll choose some really interesting work done by Daniel Shanahan and colleagues. Daniel, some of you will know, is the conservation manager in Zealandia, but in a former life, this is her postdoctoral work in Brisbane, a city that's not so unlike Auckland. So this work was based on a population survey, very carefully stratified sample of more than 1,500 people, and looking at health outcomes for those people and relating them not just to whether they're in nature, but how much. So the critical thing about this piece of work and some of the best work in the area is looking at what we might call the nature dose. How much nature is good for you. So this is based on one of the fundamental relationships in medical research, the relationship between the size of a dose and the extent of the relationship to it. So just as if you were taking a particular drug, in this case the drug is actually nature. So what are the components of a dose of nature? So Daniel and her colleague looked at three components. the frequency, the duration, and the intensity of the dose. And then they investigated relationships between those dose factors and different types of response on the vertical axis. So were there significant positive relationships between those dose factors and health response types, and how strong were those relationships? And this is really summarising the results quite succinctly. If you look particularly at frequency, for example, that improved outcomes both for social cohesion and physical activity. And physical activity then features all the way across the line. So, for example, they were able to conclude quite soundly that people who made longer visits to green spaces had lower rates of depression and lower rates of high blood pressure. And even more specifically, if you visited outdoor green spaces cumulatively for 30 minutes or more during a week, that could reduce at a population level the prevalence of depression and high blood pressure by up to 7% and 9% respectively. Now, given the costs in a country like Australia of treating high blood pressure and depression, the economic costs, let alone the personal costs and the health outcomes for the people involved, these are very significant results indeed. So I'll leave it at that for the health relationship sides, although it will come into in the subsequent comments. And I want to move through a bit of work in terms of what we know about urban green spaces in New Zealand. And you will have seen this picture before, but I can't stress it enough. I think the idea of a continuum of natural areas, many different kinds of natural areas, ranging at the left from small spaces that are private to our homes or the area immediately around our homes. So they are of a domestic scale, and then we go up to the street scale. They are a mixture of private areas and semi-private areas and public areas, and then to the familiar range of urban parks that we see in our suburbs and around our cities. Again, a range of sizes and a range of functions, but as you go further out, you tend to get larger peri-urban or outer urban green areas that have more diversity and wider. And it's only at the right-hand side of this continuum that you come to the areas, the sort of areas that we're famous for in New Zealand, of the most of the scenic preserves and the iconic wilderness areas and national parks and so on, the sorts of places that we associate with Department of Conservation Management. But of course we have many scenic preserves within our city and many natural places within a city. If you think of Otari Bush, for example, and even arguably some semi-wilderness areas, if you think certainly of the Waitaka Ranges in Auckland, if you can get into them these days, or even arguably the Orongorongas, parts of them close to Wellington. And not forgetting what is often called nowadays blue spaces, very, very important in New Zealand. And we know that there's an increasing amount of work about health effects of the blue spaces as well as green spaces. I'm going to talk mainly about the green spaces, but don't forget that we're thinking about those blue spaces both by coastal areas and by lakes and rivers. So if we have try and get an overview of urban green spaces in New Zealand as a whole, unfortunately there's very little comparative data. Given that more than 85% of us live in cities and towns in New Zealand, this is a bit of a lack. But we know enough to know that New Zealand cities on the whole are relatively well endowed with urban green space compared with most countries in the world. And some of the work that has been done from the Centre for Biodiversity and Ecology Research at Waikato University, they've done an overview of mainly native vegetation values, native biota values associated with urban parks in the 20 largest New Zealand cities. So the percentage of urban parkland as a proportion of the city area averages just over 7%, but there's quite a wide range there, you see. But of course, not all urban parkland is necessarily green space, let alone native green space. So the percentage of native vegetation cover is only a third of the total parkland area. But again, quite a wide range. And the mean number of patches of parks, if you like, is 42, which is a reasonable number as an average for our thinking of our smaller cities as well. So that even in smaller cities, there is a reasonable number of these native areas scattered around the city. If we look at a space that most of you will know, the Wellington Botanic Gardens, and here's a little bit about who uses them. And these are figures that actually would make any manager of a public service facility of any type green with envy. Wellington Botanic Gardens gets now would get more than 1 million visits annually. This is 2012 data. So a mix of 38% Wellington people, 20% visitors from elsewhere in New Zealand, that's quite a high proportion, and a very high 42% from overseas, and given the growth in our tourism in the last few years, it's probably a higher proportion yet. Now think about the social cohesion aspects of the health relationships, and you'll see that when 70% of those million visitors come with other people, and with a very wide range of people, including a large number of children, that's certainly many opportunities for social contact in the Wellington Botanic Gardens. The main activities are walking or exercising, viewing plants, and simply relaxing. Again, think back to those health relationships. But most impressively, more than 90% of those million people are either satisfied or very satisfied with their visit, and many of those visitors also mention that it's the first experience for their children of nature, especially outside of their own garden. But talking about outside of their own garden, I want to turn to the other side of the coin and just mention a very interesting study that was done in Dunedin, New Zealand Garden Study, looking at that left-hand side of my continuum. And to my view, the most interesting point about this garden study was the very first thing they found out was how much of the city domestic gardens make up. So it's more than a third of all urban land in Dunedin, and in fact getting on for half of the residential area of the city. And then they go on to associate those, the interaction of people with their gardens in terms of stress reduction, social connections, environmental stewardship and awareness, what we might call pro-environmental behaviour, as well as a number of biodiversity values. So I think that's very important to establish some of the values of these small private green spaces. Now I want to come back a little bit to some aspects of the health side, and I want to talk about the relationship between urbanisation, levels of urbanisation, the amount of green space and resultant health effects. Now this is quite a complicated story. There's a very large body of research about it, and I've shamelessly simplified this story into one slide. So bear with me. These relationships that as urbanisation proceeds, the population becomes more dense, that generally means that the amount of green space available per head will decrease, and that will have those effects on health. But those relationships are very strongly income related in many countries. As you can imagine, the poorer you are, the the fewer opportunities you have to get those health effects of relationship with the green spaces. There's a couple of photos of contrasting parts of Mumbai to illustrate that point in a country like India. And interestingly, Adelaide, a city in Australia, the very interesting study, the one I've got up there by Tom Gilberd and colleagues, showing that in all 5 largest cities in Australia, there is this strong relationship that the richer parts of the city have more contact with neighbouring green spaces. All of 5 cities, different levels of equality and inequality. But Adelaide, which is thought of as a very green city, has actually a very strong disparity in the amount of green space available depending on whether you're rich or poor. So that's, I would say, the general trend internationally of that relationship. There have been a couple of very interesting studies in New Zealand that have shown differing results. The most important, or the first one that was done by Karen Whitten, who's done a lot of important work in this area, who found that these conclusions don't hold true. There doesn't seem to be a relationship between the amount of contact you have available with green space and your health outcomes. And Karen Whitten's work's been borne out in a couple of other more recent studies, although not universally, because there have been also some studies that have shown, yes, there were relationships, particularly between mental health outcomes and your contact with green space. So the jury's out still on that one, but I think what would be agreed by the people who haven't established these relationships is that in New Zealand, and there are other parts of the world, where much of the population has got good access to green space, whether you are rich or whether you are poor, and that's one aspect that we haven't got, or we thought we didn't have increasingly inequality about. For example, a photo there of Porirua Park in some of the poorest parts of Wellington, but it is actually relatively well endowed with green space both locally and in the surrounding area. So, as Karen said, where most of the population has good access to green or blue space, even when you have less money or you're living in a large urban area, this relationship is less strong. So, as I say, I think that the jury is still out, but that's the general conclusion. Most of these studies are not discriminating about the types of green space that people have access to or can see, or they are generalising across the whole city. So I think it's worth looking at some more detailed studies that I and colleagues have been involved with in Wellington, and bringing it back here to start looking at this pattern a little bit more. So the first one I want to mention is a very recently completed master's thesis by Nadia Freeman, a student of mine. And Nadia used a very innovative new technology to look at children's these 11 to 13-year-old children and their access to green space. It's called the Kids Cam, so the kids wear a little portable camera on a lanyard around their neck, and this actually allows views of what the children are actually doing and where they are. It sounds a bit Big Brotherish, but it's been very, very carefully anonymised, and it's produced some really interesting results in a number of areas. So Nadia was the first to use the technology to look at kids' access to green space, and she was relating this to anonymised data about the deprivation levels of the children and their families and the schools that they went to, the schools recorded by school decile. And those pictures are examples of the actual scenes that the kids' camera shows. So again, it's interesting to point out that public playing fields, public fields and private gardens were the two most frequently visited green space by the sample of kids as a whole. These deprivation relationships, so students from high decile schools, that is low levels of socioeconomic deprivation, visited green space much more frequently than kids from middle deciles and lower decile schools. And a particularly interesting result, because it's different from most of the international literature, that girls were visiting green space twice more frequently than boys and spending more time per visit than boys. And also in line with our data from the Wellington Botanic Gardens, kids were almost always accompanied by someone else, often of course a supervising adult. So we followed this up with the start of a study by a summer student of mine, Fiona Chan, working with Rafe Chapman, Ed Randall and myself. And Fiona did a census of the types of green space in 4 contrasting census area units, so we could get some population data. So going from north to south, Linden up on the very northern boundary of the town, and then Kandala Broad Meadows, closer in what I call a middle suburb, and then we've got Oriental Bay, very much an inner city suburb, and finally Willis Street, Cambridge Terrace, very much a CBD suburb. So differences in population and area, but also strong differences in their socioeconomic deprivation levels. So Linden and Willis Street, Cambridge Terrace had higher levels of deprivation, and Kandala Broadmeadows and Oriental Bay very low levels of deprivation. And the results of the amount of green space are very interesting. So the first point to make is that this was just looking at areas that are actually designated as parks or road reserves. So they are public green space, but that doesn't equate to the amount of actual green space, grass or vegetation or tree cover. So the actual level of green space as a percentage of public parks or road reserves never got higher than 60%. And down in the CBD, it was as low as 11%. And correspondingly, if you looked as the total public green space as a percentage of the census area, quite high in both the outer suburbs, but much lower in the inner suburb of Oriental Bay, and much lower again in Willis Street, Cambridge Terrace. And if you then put your population density, that's where the unequal distribution really comes out. So that Linden and Kandala have no, remember, high deprivation, low deprivation, but no difference in terms of the amount of green space available per person. In fact, Linden had higher, Oriental Bay much lower, and Willis Street, Cambridge Terrace much lower again. Remember that in the central parts of both Wellington and Auckland cities, our population is actually increasing in density quite significantly, so that the centre of Auckland and Wellington now has a comparable population density to many parts of the big cities in Australia. Now, I haven't got time. Recently we've looked at private green space to complement this data. I haven't got time to go through that, but suffice to say that the private green space story adds to and accentuates these inequalities and these differences. In particular, it tells us that in Oriental Bay, for example, the availability of private green space nearly makes up for that lack of public green space that you see there. And it also tells us that the high deprivation areas, both in Linden and in Cambridge Terrace, Willis Street, are much more dependent on public space. Finally, I want to I've covered that. Finally, I want to mention one more master's thesis done by Francis Forsythe at Victoria University, supervised by Wayne Linklater. Basically this was a detailed inventory of different green spaces, different natural areas on the campus. As you know, it's a very compact campus. You might be surprised to know that there are nearly 4 hectares of green space on the campus. And Francis was able to not only do the detailed inventory of what's there now, but to track changes over the last 25 years, and found that there's actually been a high loss of biological diversity from the campus. It's been particularly marked for introduced species rather than for native species. Although even with the introduced species, the native species, there's been a lot of loss and a lot of gain. But the net loss was higher for introduced species, and there was a net loss overall, and it was particularly marked for large trees of both native and introduced species. There's a whole lot of stuff there in Francis' thesis in terms of favourite places in the campus. And those are indicated by the little yellow labels at different parts of the campus. Differences between staff and students, different age groups, between whether they saw the health benefits or the social contact benefits or simply the flora and fauna of benefits or the social benefits. But when asked what do you want more of, both staff and students together tended to want sunny spots. That's strange for Victoria University campus. More birds and bees and trees, but also more seats. Not all the things they wanted are compatible with each other. But a conclusion that I would make from looking at Francis' material, none of this is published yet by the way, is that if Victoria University continues to grow as it wishes to do, there could well become a point where the demand for green space, and Francis' thesis documents that demand for green space very well, will outstrip the amount that's available on the campus. So very nice as a, if you like, a supply and demand study within one major institution or one little corner of Wellington City. So to summarise what I feel that New Zealand cities offer for green space, on the whole they are well endowed with green space. On the whole we have relatively good access, but certainly I think that the data from Wellington City, and I suspect it would be a similar picture in Auckland City, I'm not aware of any data on that, would show that there are some increasing disparities, and those disparities will increase over time. Generally high quality parks and urban spaces, and still some great natural settings close to cities, and some good programs to make use of it. I want to finish by just quickly talking about a very provocative question. Could we have too much green space in Wellington City? This comes out of some very interesting work from Germany, amongst other places, that shows that the positive effect on people's well-being of the amount of green space available actually plateaued, or actually reached a peak at a certain level and then decreased. And that led those authors to the concept of optimum green space benefits. So beyond that optimum, the marginal positive effects of green space were outweighed by the positive effects of other density-related amenities. In other words, you need to have more people to get those benefits. Things like economic opportunities, transport routes, entertainment and cultural opportunities, etc. So is there a downside of a more than optimal level of green space, considering all aspects of urban form and resilience? So there you go. Did you ever expect to hear an ecologist talking like an economist like that? I think for Wellington, I'll come on to that, it does make you think about Wellington, where we have a lot of green space, And our outer and middle suburbs, as I've shown, are very, very well endowed with green space regardless of your level of wealth, your level of deprivation. And let's face it, we mightn't often want to acknowledge this, but green space can compete with other amenities, even for transport, even in certain locations uncomfortably close to here, like the Basin Reserve. But the way I'd like to think about it is that green spaces provide many ecosystem services benefits. I haven't talked much about ecosystem services, but that's basically the way that I see these benefits of green spaces. Quite apart from their biodiversity benefits, they are important as transport routes in their own right. For active transport, they're absolutely critical for water management. They can be very important for food supply even, and climate regulation. And coming to our resilience, or back to our resilience theme, I think that the Christchurch earthquake and the particular example of Latimer Square, one large green space in the middle of the city, what an incredible refuge and resource that provided, both during and after the disaster, for all aspects of the resilience continuum of reduction, readiness, response, recovery. So that is also a very, very important aspect of green spaces. So I think that, in fact, a better way of thinking about green space than simply do we have too much or not enough. By the way, I think it's unthinkable that in Wellington we have too much space in the centre of the city, as shown by those data of ours, but there is room for thought about some of those outer suburbs. But we need to consider other aspects than just the absolute amount of and availability of green space. We need to consider its quality, and here I'll bring in blue space as well. We need to think about its accessibility. We need to think about the balance between public and private and middle situations, what people sometimes call third spaces. And we need to think about the needs of different population groups. So if we think of those as a number of principles, then you notice that none of those principles is defined just by the absolute quantity. So quality and accessibility are all critical, and arguably as critical as the absolute amount. So this would be my conclusion. What would we want from our green spaces in Wellington? I would put at the top of the list green spaces that are accessible to everybody. That doesn't mean equal density everywhere, but it does imply that access has to be equitable. It does also imply that all modes of transport have to be able to be used to get to green spaces. We want green spaces that offer many opportunities for health and well-being, that are good for biodiversity and other ecosystem services. Green spaces and blue spaces that complement each other and also complement other public spaces. We want green spaces that are resilient and that enhance the city's resilience in turn. And I thought of this, developed this list thinking solely about Wellington, but then I realised that probably those values are pretty universal and applicable to almost all cities. So thought in that way, there's no doubt that we have a wonderful basis here in Wellington for the contribution of green spaces to our health and well-being, but also a wonderful base for improvement. And I'd just like to finish by thanking quite a lot of people, some of them here, who've helped me with data, with lots of ideas and with lots of support in various ways. Thanks very much.
Kia ora koutou, ko Peter toko ingoa, ki te harakoa o ki te i koutou I tēnei rā. I'm just going to make a few brief remarks and then hand over to the expert. But I just want to say that one of my roles on City Council is City Scientist. And what we're trying to achieve there is to recognise the great abilities we have around the city in terms of the expertise. And I think we've had a very great example of that today from Paul. So the expertise that we have in Wellington to make this city better and sort of really inform our policy in a really good way. And I'm sure the family will pick up some of those practical points. I just also want to just recognise Paul. Paul pops up everywhere. He's an ecological consultant, he's a lecturer, he's a researcher. We see him at council giving submissions, and very valuable submissions on the policies that we're introducing, and he even pops up at the chamber music and so on. He's got a very good persona, so he's making a very valuable contribution to Wellington, and I would just like to recognise you, Paul, and thank you on behalf of the city for the great work that you do. The other portfolio I have is natural environment, and it's the easiest portfolio in council because we have such an expert team and so many volunteers out there in the community. And one of those experts is Myfanwy Emeny, so I'll let you, Myfanwy, pick up a few points, and I may or may not come back later. Thank you.
Thanks, Peter. So I'm going to hope that my voice holds up. Thankfully I'm not talking for too long. I'm also going to try and follow my big scribbles of notes I was just making as Paul was speaking. So in terms of picking up on some of his points, I think the accessibility one is a really, really valid and important one. We've picked that up on some of our council policies. We've picked up on that through things like the Open Space Access Plan. We want to make sure there's accessibility for people. We've also picked up on that through things like our play policies, making sure places like playgrounds where children actually want to go are evenly distributed around the city. The one point I do want to make on that is that it's not just about accessibility, and I guess it's one of the things that sometimes concerns me when we just look at the amount of green space, because it really is that quality issue. So it's not just can you get to a local green space, but actually what's in that green space, and is it something that's going to draw people into it? So is it a green space where we've actually just got a regenerating hillside with no tracks in it, or actually is it a green space where you've got some flat kickabout space, you might have a playground, you might have, a bit of a bush remnant with a walk through it. So we've really got to keep that in the back of our minds the whole time. It's not just about quantity, it's about quality. That's really, really important. And I think that kids camp, also, I guess, illuminated that to me even further with the fact that, of course, kids are going to sports fields, they're going to playgrounds, they're not just going to walk a bush track. And I can speak from my children's experience, they either go to the playground at school or they go down to the field to kick a ball about. The other point I wanted to pick up on, now I'm just trying to find my notes. And again, so it's around the many opportunities for health and well-being, and I think it is that many opportunities, and that's where that demographic point that was in one of Paul's slides. We really need to think about the needs of our community. We need to think about those changing demographics and be really clever about looking at the projections of what our community is going to look like in 20, 30, 40, 50 years' time. We need to look at where our families are going to be. We need to look at who's going to be living in the central city. Is it more children? Do we need more playgrounds and flat kickabout space in the central city? Are they in the suburbs? So all of that has to be taken into account as well. So it's really delving into things, I think, in a much more intricate level of detail about what those demographics are going to be and actually what they want from the future also. In terms of the question, could we have too much green space? Of course not. This is me being a typical ecologist here. It's a very human-centric view, I think, everything we've been talking about, which is fantastic. People are an integral part of our biodiversity. Of course, we're in there, but actually, as an ecologist working in the urban environment, I think we do need to balance all these things together. And we've got some species that can coexist really happily with us in an urban environment. I think around probably 100 metres from where we are now, we have Karearea, the falcon flying over Civic Square. We have Kaka attacking our trees in Civic Square in the dark of night when nobody's watching. And we've got Korora, the little blue penguin, nesting in the waterfront as well. So we do have some of these species that, yes, they're great, and actually I don't think it matters so much about how we structure that green space around them. But then we've got species like our tieki, our saddleback, our North Island robin, our hehe, and these are our shy little forest birds. And we're really lucky in Wellington that we have these species here. We often boast about it, it's fantastic, but actually these are the species that need some of those big green spaces out in the suburbs, a bit further away from people, further away from disturbance, further away from houses, so we don't have to worry so much about cats and dogs and all those other threats to them. So we need to think about them in the picture as well, and what do they need, and they don't need a road through their home all the time. And I think on that point as well, there's that tension between some of our green spaces and how it's used, which for us is a wonderful problem to have. So again, we've got a reserve we're looking at the moment, and it's got tieki, so the saddleback, threatened species, nesting in it. And we've got all these people that want to use it, and everybody's saying, I want a walking track, and I want a biking track, and I want an e-bike track. And so we've got to actually balance that as well. So we've got to have a think about where are some of these spaces where we can just let people run rampant a little bit, and where are some of the spaces we've actually got to say, actually, no, we think that's enough now, and these species need to coexist here also. Or, sure, go nuts, and actually they've got somewhere else to be. So we've got to manage that tension in terms of that interaction between our green spaces and how people want to use it. And I guess just one final point, or maybe two final points, shall I say. I also just wanted to cover off, because I've got a scribble on the corner of my page here of a pyramid, which would remind me about, again, the needs of different sorts of areas. So let's go back to that point for a moment. There's something that we often refer to called the nature pyramid. So it's the idea that in terms of those doses of nature, you could have a daily dose of nature, which is your backyard, which is the trees around your work. You can have a weekly dose of nature, which is maybe your local park, your local reserve. You might walk in there a couple of times a week. You can have your monthly dose of nature, which might be your regional park. Then maybe once a year go for a huge big tramp in a dock, a dock conservation state. And actually you need all of those different parts, so it's not sort of one or the other, it's how you have all of those together, and how you work those doses of nature, so you make sure you're always getting something a little bit different, because at the end of the day, sort of a green space isn't a green space isn't a green space, they're all different in their different ways. And now this is my final point, and it goes back to the point that I'd made around quality of green space, because I find the Kandala kind of Linden Oriental Bay thing quite interesting, because yes, Linden's got quite a lot of green space, but I guess it also goes back to investment, and this is something we really have to watch as a council in terms of how are we ensuring that the quality of our green spaces for all those communities. So the only recent conversations we've really been having with our communities around green spaces and quality is actually in Kandala and Oriental Bay, and that's quite a typical sort of pattern. So these discussions about levels of service, and we want this and we want that from our green space, tends to happen in those communities. It doesn't tend to happen in Linden, it doesn't tend to happen in Strathmore Park. So when we're making these decisions as a council, we again have to think about not just where the spaces are, but what are we putting in them, how are we servicing them, and what do our communities want from them. So I will leave it there, so we've got time for questions.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Myfanwy.
I think it is something that we're thinking about as a council, is how to make sure you can get that everyday greenness. And I think there's another point that I never go into, but it's that the difference between open space versus green space, and I think we as a council need to think a bit more about that as well, and how the communities are using the spaces. So it's great for people to have an open space that may be, hard surface with some trees, but actually at what point does that move so far away from green space you're stopping to get those values? So this is something we're thinking about at the moment. Absolutely, we need to be looking at where else can we put in street trees, where else can we put in water sensitive urban design features so we can have that resilience as well. So yeah, it's nothing we've got an immediate answer to, but in all those sorts of future developments, we're definitely trying to get more elements of green space. And again, it could be green walls, it could be green roads, and how to get a whole lot of co-benefits from human health to water quality.
Yes, thanks. I would repeat the point that Myfanwy made about the amount of green space within what is called our reserved areas, and certainly that analysis I was struck mostly by the low amount of green space in our inner city parks. So I think that sometimes in our desire for good design and exciting design, we may have lost sight of the need for green space as well. So the question is about artificial turfs, and of course we've got a lovely example just right outside the door with the green lawn in the Civic Square. That has done amazing things to attract people to the Civic Square. So I would certainly put it on that continuum of green spaces. It's not very natural, but it certainly brings people into a space where perhaps you could mingle that with more elements of green and the other things that might contribute to that daily or weekly dose. And this is where I would come back to that point that I made, that in our understanding, I think we have we've got a better understanding about the dose of nature that we need, but I think we still have a very poor understanding of what is it about nature that is important and therefore important to bring into our urban environments.
Yeah, I think anything that allows people to get outside, particularly children. So obviously we've got an artificial turf, they can get out there more. I was watching rugby the other day. It was a wet day and the kids were sliding down the mud bank, much to the chagrin of the gentleman looking after or woman looking after the park. But if people are out and enjoying the facilities on Saturday morning or whatever, they'll be exploring the rest of the terrain too.
I think it's a very, very good question. Basically what I was alluding to before about we are struggling with that quality of green space versus just quantity. One thing we are trying to do is we're combining things like our management plans a lot more, so we're trying to look at much bigger chunks and actually have that quality of our management plans. We go, so, where are the flat kickabout spaces, where are the decent walks, where are the areas that we're going to be regenerating, and not just looking kind of in a piecemeal approach, but trying to be a bit more consistent. We're also doing a lot more work at the moment around what people actually want from their green space. So I think we're getting better and better actually going out and talking to the communities and surveying, and that's, there's a big community project happening in Karori at the moment, and those are getting rolled out from the council, so we can have a clearer idea about what are people after. So I think that's also where we sometimes fall down, as we make a few assumptions about they want this, they want that, and actually communities want very, very different things from their green spaces. And in some areas where either you've got, young kids or the elderly, for example, we found we need to put in more, more flat, easy walks, because a lot of people don't want those really steep walks, and that's again, we then have the tension between that means more vegetation removal and more impact, so we've got to weigh that up as well. So I'm afraid I don't have a great answer for you. It's something that's an issue we're aware of, and it's an issue that we're trying to work on to make sure we have that quality.
Can I just add that a lot of children in particular have structured activities these days, so there is a lot of effort going into, for example, building resources such as a Discovery Garden, a new children's garden, where there'll be cover, but there'll be quite intensive educational opportunity. The zoo has just upgraded its living room, which is the educational centre. Zealandia has groups of children in from low-decile schools in particular. So some of the green space that people can see can be in that more structured environment and sheltered.
Well, thanks very much, Meredith. So the question was about, or the point was about accessibility, particularly for various disability levels. I'd comment, I think that's a very really useful observation and input to that whole question of accessibility. I still think that as a general principle of accessibility for all, and you've given a very good example of a group with very specific needs, they are very specific, but in fact addressing those needs will also increase accessibility for a whole lot of other people as well. So the point about you have to have many different ways of getting sometimes to even quite local and maybe very modest little neighbourhood parks, but those might be the ones that the kids you're interested in, their families are able to get to. So you have to think about that full spectrum of parks and reserves, and not just a few of the sort of destination parks as they call them.
One thing I just wanted to say is that I have this continual desire to actually find research such as that, and I really, really struggle, like as a parks operational person, to actually find out when people are doing research that's relevant to the decisions that we're making. And I think it's actually something across the board that we probably need to get a bit better at. So, is there something that we can do as operational people, or how we manage parks, how we space them out, that can actually make it better for that group of people, as opposed to say that it's damaging? Because I think there's a lot of willingness to try and make all the areas accessible, but we do, as a city council, we're not sort of always out there, we're not across all the research, so we struggle to pull it all together. So I guess just a plea, if anyone in the crowd has anything similar, then we are always doors open in terms of finding out what are those issues and is there something we can do to resolve them. But if we don't know it's an issue, we can't actually fix it.
I think it's a great point, so thank you for raising it. I just want to raise a little thing that we've been doing up in the northern suburbs. So we've got a couple of hospital level homes up there, and the question is, how do people that are in the twilight of their lives, perhaps have dementia, severe arthritis, how do they engage with the natural environment? Well, in this case what they do is they actually propagate native seeds, they grow them, they pop them on, and then occasionally they get out through the four-wheel drive to the parks where those plants are planted. So there's more than one way of involving in the great outdoors.
Yeah, well, thanks, Paul, and I would certainly acknowledge that didn't have time to touch on so many important functions of urban green spaces, but having large trees is actually one of them, because large trees probably as one particular kind of biota, of biodiversity in our green spaces, probably have the most number of values. So I'd actually disagree with you on, well, we can't have big trees everywhere. We actually should be aiming to have as many big trees as possible, as far as possible. Certainly for climate change in hotter climates, there's really strong research showing the necessity that's going to be to have more trees because of the shading and the temperature effects they have. Shelter is important. We can't all get out into these sheltered gullies or more remote areas. And I think there's also really good evidence from so many parts of the world. I'm aware of research in Auckland as well as Wellington that shows that it's our larger trees that are suffering, that are being lost the most, and those are the most valuable from a biodiversity and from an ecosystem services perspective. So I would make a plea to have as many large trees going back in as possible.
So I was going to make one more point, just because it ties into that and it ties into the accessibility thing. I think the other thing that we need to get better at as a council is accessibility about information. So I think information about actually where can people walk if they've got a variety of mobility issues. Where are wheelchair-friendly tracks? Where are our sheltered walks you can take on a windy day? So it's also something we're looking at. We've got a whole lot of information, but we definitely have to provide that more in a more digestible way as well.